The autumn leaves swirled outside the picture window of my parents' suburban home as I sat at their dining room table, the same mahogany surface where I'd done homework 20 years earlier. The familiar scent of my mother's lavender potpourri mixed with the tension that had become standard at these monthly family dinners. Margaret and Harold Brennan, my parents, had perfected the art of disappointment over my 31 years of life, and tonight's performance was particularly polished. "Sarah, honey, your father and I have been talking," my mother began, her voice carrying that practiced tone of parental concern mixed with exasperation. "It's time for you to stop this medical school fantasy and focus on building a real career." My father nodded emphatically from his position at the head of the table, adjusting his reading glasses as he consulted what appeared to be a printed article. "I found some statistics about medical school debt and physician burnout. The average medical school graduate owes $200,000 and works 80-hour weeks. It's not sustainable, especially at your age." I continued eating my mother's pot roast quietly, accustomed to these interventions. At 31, I was apparently too old to be playing doctor, as they put it, despite having completed my residency 3 years earlier and currently working what they believed was an entry-level position at a small medical facility downtown. "The thing is, sweetheart," my mother continued, reaching across the table to pat my hand, "you're a smart girl, but medical school is incredibly competitive. Maybe it's time to consider more realistic options. Your cousin Jennifer just got promoted to regional manager at that pharmaceutical company. She's making excellent money, and she didn't have to spend a decade in school." My father leaned forward, warming to the topic. "Your mother's right. You've been at this for years now, first the pre-med classes, then that entry-level job at the clinic, now you're talking about specializing in cancer treatment. When are you going to accept that maybe medicine isn't your calling?" "I'm not talking about specializing in oncology, Dad. I am specialized in oncology," I replied evenly, though I knew the distinction would be lost on them. Harold waved his hand dismissively. "Sarah, working at a community health center doing basic patient intake isn't the same thing as being an oncologist. You're not performing surgery or managing complex cancer cases. You're essentially a very educated nurse." The irony wasn't lost on me. The community health center where I supposedly worked was actually the Brennan Cancer Research Institute, a facility I'd established 4 years earlier. My parents had never bothered to visit, despite it being located less than 5 miles from their home. They'd constructed their own version of my life based on fragments of conversations and their own assumptions about what constituted success. My mother pulled out her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be job listings. "Look at this. There's an opening for a pharmaceutical sales representative. Starting salary is $90,000, company car, full benefits. You could use your medical background without all the stress and liability of actual medical practice. And the hours would be much better," my father added. "Normal business schedule, weekends free, opportunities for advancement. You could have a real work-life balance instead of being on call all the time for medical emergencies." I sipped my wine, considering how to respond to their latest career counseling session. These conversations had been happening monthly for the past 3 years, ever since they'd learned I was still pursuing medical stuff instead of settling into what they considered a more conventional professional path. "Sarah, dear, you're 31 years old," my mother continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your biological clock is ticking, and you need to think about your future. How are you going to attract a successful husband if you're always working at some clinic? Men want women who are available, who can be partners in building a real life together." My father nodded approvingly. "Your mother has a point. Dr. Harrison's son David is a successful attorney, and is looking for a wife. But he wants someone established in a traditional career, not someone who's still figuring out their professional identity." The conversation continued in this familiar pattern for another hour, with my parents offering increasingly creative alternatives to my medical career. My mother suggested I could become a pharmaceutical company liaison, using my medical knowledge to bridge the gap between doctors and drug manufacturers. My father thought I should consider medical writing, creating content for pharmaceutical marketing materials and health websites. Through it all, I maintained my composure, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions about their suggestions. They had no idea that my phone was buzzing with messages from the chief financial officer of Brennan Medical Holdings, the parent company of my 7 cancer treatment centers across 3 states. They didn't know that the on-call medical emergencies they worried about were actually board meetings and consultations with other oncology centers seeking to implement my treatment protocols. My phone rang during dessert, the caller ID showing Dr. Patricia Yamamoto, my mother's new oncologist. I had recommended Dr. Yamamoto when my mother's routine mammogram had revealed suspicious calcifications 3 weeks earlier, though I'd done so through carefully orchestrated back channels to avoid revealing my professional connections. I should take this, I said, stepping into the kitchen as my parents continued their discussion about my career prospects. Dr. Brennan, Dr. Yamamoto's voice was professional but concerned. I've completed my review of your mother's pathology reports and imaging studies. The diagnosis is confirmed, invasive ductal carcinoma, stage 2. We need to discuss treatment options immediately. What are you recommending? I asked, though I'd already reviewed her scans and test results through the hospital's secure portal. Chemotherapy followed by surgical resection, then radiation therapy. However, given the specific genetic markers we've identified, I'd like to recommend treatment at the Brennan Cancer Research Institute. They have protocols for this exact tumor profile that have shown remarkable success rates. I paused, considering the implications. Dr. Yamamoto, the treatment protocols you're referring to, I developed them. I'm the medical director and owner of the Brennan Cancer Research Institute. The silence that followed was profound. Dr. Brennan, I had no idea. Your mother listed you as her emergency contact and mentioned you work in healthcare, but she described you as working at a community clinic. It's complicated, I replied, glancing toward the dining room where my parents were still discussing my need to get serious about my career. Dr. Yamamoto, I need to inform my parents about the diagnosis, and I think it would be appropriate for you to call them directly to discuss the treatment recommendations. Of course. Should I mention your role at the institute? That's probably going to come up naturally when you explain why you're recommending treatment there. I returned to the dining room, where my parents had moved on to discussing vacation plans for the following spring. They looked up expectantly as I rejoined them at the table. Mom, Dad, that was Dr. Yamamoto, Mom's oncologist. She has some important information to share about the test results. She's going to call you directly. My mother's face went pale. Is it cancer? Yes, Mom. But it's very treatable, especially with early detection like this. Dr. Yamamoto wants to discuss treatment options with you. As if on cue, the house phone rang. My father answered, his expression shifting from casual concern to focused attention as Dr. Yamamoto explained the diagnosis and recommended treatment plan. Dr. Yamamoto, could you repeat that about the treatment facility? My father asked, reaching for a pen to take notes. The Brennan Cancer Research Institute? We've never heard of it. I could hear Dr. Yamamoto's voice through the phone speaker as she explained the institute's reputation, treatment success rates, and specific protocols for my mother's type of cancer. Then came the moment I'd been anticipating. The facility is owned and directed by Dr. Sarah Brennan, one of the leading oncologists in the region. She's pioneered several of the treatment approaches we use for cases like your wife's. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents stared at me with expressions of complete bewilderment as the implications of Dr. Yamamoto's words sank in. Dr. Sarah Brennan, my mother whispered. But that's our daughter. Sarah, you're not a doctor. You work at a community clinic. My father was still holding the phone, his face cycling through confusion and dawning realization. Dr. Yamamoto, are you saying our daughter Sarah is the owner of this cancer treatment center? Yes, sir. Dr. Brennan is not only the owner but also the medical director. She's published extensively on oncology treatment protocols and serves on several national cancer research committees. Your daughter is quite renowned in the field of oncology. After my father hung up, the three of us sat in stunned silence. The evening that had begun with career counseling about abandoning my medical hobby had suddenly transformed into something entirely different. Sarah, my mother said quietly, I don't understand. How long have you been a doctor? How long have you owned a cancer treatment center? I've been a licensed physician for 4 years, and I've been an oncologist for 3 years. I established the Brennan Cancer Research Institute 4 years ago, and we now operate 7 facilities across the region. My father shook his head in amazement. But you never told us. You let us think you were working at some entry-level clinic job. Dad, I tried to tell you about my work many times. Every time I mentioned oncology research or cancer treatment protocols, you dismissed it as playing doctor or told me to focus on real career options. The truth began to unfold as my parents processed this revelation. The community health center I supposedly worked at was actually my primary research facility. The on-call emergencies they worried about were consultations with other oncologists seeking advice on complex cases. The entry-level medical work they'd been encouraging me to abandon was actually groundbreaking research that had been published in major medical journals. Sarah, if you're the owner of these treatment centers, what does that mean financially? My mother asked, her practical nature asserting itself even in the midst of her cancer diagnosis. Mom, the Brennan Medical Holdings company that owns the treatment centers had revenues of $47 million last year. I also receive licensing fees from other cancer centers that use my treatment protocols. Financially, I'm doing quite well. My father sat back in his chair, his expression shifting between amazement and embarrassment. Sarah, we've been telling you to get a pharmaceutical sales job while you own a multi-million-dollar medical company. That's about the size of it, Dad. Over the next few hours, as we discussed my mother's treatment plan, more details emerged about my actual professional life. The medical journals scattered around my apartment weren't light reading, they contained my published research. The conferences I attended weren't networking events, they were presentations of my clinical findings to other oncologists. The irregular schedule they'd been concerned about was the result of managing multiple cancer treatment facilities and conducting research studies. But what affected my parents most was learning about the scope of my work. The Brennan Cancer Research Institute had treated over 3,000 patients in 4 years, with success rates that exceeded national averages for most cancer types. The treatment protocols I'd developed were being implemented by cancer centers across the country, potentially helping tens of thousands of patients. Why didn't you insist on telling us the truth? My mother asked as we planned her treatment schedule. Mom, every time I tried to explain what I was actually doing, you redirected the conversation toward more realistic career options. You'd already decided that my medical work wasn't legitimate before you bothered to learn what it actually involved. My father nodded slowly. Sarah, I owe you an enormous apology. We both do. We've been completely wrong about everything. You weren't wrong about me working in healthcare, Dad. You were wrong about assuming you understood what that work entailed. The following weeks brought a complete transformation in our family dynamic. As my mother underwent treatment at the facility I'd built, using protocols I'd developed, my parents began to understand the reality of what I'd accomplished. The phone calls from colleagues, the research grants, the patient success stories, it all painted a picture of someone operating at the highest levels of medical practice and research. More importantly, they saw me in my element, making treatment decisions, leading clinical teams, and advancing cancer care through research and innovation. The daughter they'd been encouraging to abandon medicine was actually saving lives and pioneering treatments that would benefit cancer patients worldwide. My mother's treatment was successful, thanks to the early detection and the targeted therapy protocols we'd developed at the institute. During her recovery, she often reflected on the irony of the situation. Sarah, I can't believe we spent years telling you to stop playing doctor while you were actually becoming one of the leading oncologists in the region. Mom, you weren't wrong about medicine being challenging. You were wrong about thinking I wasn't capable of meeting those challenges. As my mother completed her treatment and returned to full health, our family found a new equilibrium. The monthly dinners continued, but without the career counseling sessions. Instead, my parents took pride in sharing stories about their daughter's medical achievements with friends and neighbors. Some family relationships are built on assumptions and misunderstandings that persist for years. Ours was transformed by the realization that the daughter they'd been trying to redirect toward a sensible career had actually built something extraordinary while they weren't paying attention. More importantly, when cancer threatened our family, the person they dismissed as playing doctor was the one who saved my mother's life.